I would argue that the most serious threat to the United States is not someone hiding in a cave in Afghanistan or Pakistan, but our own fiscal irresponsibility.
The President of the United States.
These United States are confronted with an economic affliction of great proportions.
America may be headed for a recession.
And I must say to you that the state of the Union is not good.
We are engaged in a long and hard fight against inflation.
Our trade deficit is too large.
Part of our trouble is that we have been self-indulgent, and now the bill has come due.
Unless we act forcefully, and now, the economy will get worse.
But I pledge to you tonight that the full powers of this government will be used to keep America's economy producing.
What we need is spending discipline in Washington, D.C.
And thus restore balance to our economy.
We will continue along the path toward a balanced budget.
Once it's balanced, we will start paying off the national debt.
And now we are on course for budget surpluses for the next 25 years.
A stronger nation and economy requires more than a balanced budget.
Only a true partnership between government and the people can ever hope to reach these goals.
We must act today in order to preserve tomorrow.
We must solve problems, not leave them to future generations.
We won't leave it to our children and our grandchildren.
We must not go back to unwise spending.
We must strive to break the calamitous cycle and help dispel the uncertainty that so many feel about our economy.
And tonight, that cause goes on. God bless.
What hit the economy first was a housing slump. Fears spread to Wall Street. Consumers tightened their purse strings.
The U.S. Federal Reserve cut its key interest rate by half a point.
The I word, inflation, is coming to the fore.
Major developments on the lending crisis in the U.S. Oil and gold prices are spiking.
Nuclear strike here on our financial market.
And it's complicated because of where we are in the election cycle.
Huge disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street.
Who is David Walker and why should we care? He's the nation's top accountant, the Comptroller General of the United States. He's totaled up the government's income, liabilities, and future obligations and concluded that our current standard of living is unsustainable unless some drastic action is taken, and he's not alone.
I'm Dave Walker, Comptroller General of the United States. So I'm head of the U.S. Government Accountability Office, better known as the GAO. We're in the legislative branch of government. Basically, we're about improving transparency, enhancing government performance, and assuring accountability for the benefit of the American people. I was set to be career military, and I had appointments to the Naval and Air Force academies, but I couldn't go at the last minute because I have a bad left ear, and it kept me out of my military career. I knew it was only a matter of time before I decided to serve my country in some way, and I've been fortunate to have 3 presidential appointments, one from Reagan, one from Bush 41, and this one from Clinton. It's been a pleasure and an honor to serve my country.
We suffer from a fiscal cancer. It is growing within us. And if we do not treat it, it could have catastrophic consequences for our country.
How big is the federal debt?
I don't know.
I'm guessing quite a bit.
I wouldn't know that.
Like 3 million?
I know it's in the billions.
I have no idea.
If it's in the billions or trillions.
No, it's a heck of a lot more than it was probably 10 years ago.
Well, take a stab at it.
69 billion.
It's probably huge.
What if I told you it was $8.7 trillion?
That's pretty crazy. Wow. That's shouldn't be that way.
$8.7 trillion. Just how much money is that? With a number this large, it helps to compare it to the overall size of America's economy, what economists call the gross domestic product, or GDP. In February 2007, when our federal debt was $8.7 trillion, our GDP was around $13.5 trillion. That meant that our federal debt was about 64% of our GDP. This level of debt to GDP is not the real problem. It's where we're headed that matters, and it's projected to get much worse in the future. In addition, as you'll find out soon, this $8.7 trillion number is only a fraction of our nation's total fiscal challenge.
Chairman Conrad, Senator Gregg, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to discuss solutions to the nation's long-term fiscal challenges. I'm Robert Bixby, and I'm the Executive Director of the Concord Coalition. It's a nonpartisan organization, it's a grassroots organization, and we advocate fiscal responsibility. Well, our current fiscal policy is unsustainable. Most people from the left or the right agree on that. They may disagree on how to deal with it, but most people think that eventually the fiscal policy of the country is headed over a cliff. This is the federal budget for 1988. It's jam-packed with numbers, and it's got some descriptions in the beginning of the programs that the president was pushing. Here is the budget for 2005, for a couple of years ago. The main budget document it's got some numbers in it. It has pictures in it. There's a lot of color pictures in it and glossy paper and things. It's not what it used to be, where you just had numbers and some descriptions of the programs. It's kind of a metaphor for what's happened with federal government.
Here we go. If you just joined us, David Walker, who is Comptroller General of the U.S., is here in the studio with us. For the past few years, you've gone around the country on what you've called fiscal wake-up tours. Tell us what those are and why you're doing this.
There's a coalition of groups that has come together. The key players are the Concord Coalition, the Brookings Institution, the Heritage Foundation, and myself as Comptroller General of the United States. We have many other organizations that are involved as well, but those are the four cornerstones. What we're doing is we're going outside the Beltway to state the facts and speak the truth to the American people, to help them understand where we've been, where we are, where we're headed. Because my view is the only way that elected officials are going to make the tough choices is if the people understand the need for these choices and will not punish them for doing what's right for America's future. The facts aren't Democrat or Republican. The facts aren't liberal or conservative. The facts are the facts. And, there's broad-based agreement among the fiscal wake-up tour participants that span the political spectrum, that our financial condition is worse than advertised, that we need to act soon because time is working against us. America faces four serious deficits today. The first is a budget deficit. The second is a savings deficit. The third is a balance of payments deficit, of which the trade deficit is a subset. And the fourth and most serious of all is a leadership deficit.
How can this be happening to the richest country in the world?
Well, we've lost our way, quite frankly. Let me tell you how we got to where we are. Today's federal debt is the sum of all of our annual budget deficits and surpluses going back to the beginning of our federal government. Our war for independence created much of our early debt, and by March 4th, 1789, the first day of our federal government, our national debt was $75 million, which was about 40% of our economy. This terrified our founding fathers, and they acted quickly to pay it down. We didn't stay there for long. The Civil War not only had a huge human cost, it brought the United States to the brink of bankruptcy. However, like before, we paid our debt down quickly. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created to help manage the nation's money supply and to oversee national banks. That year was also the birth of the modern income tax. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Several years later, the Great Depression brought with it extreme economic hardship for millions of Americans.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 millions of our citizens.
It is insurance that you and your employer have bought and paid for.
World War II was a time of sacrifice, and while the government took on unprecedented levels of debt, Americans bought savings bonds to finance our winning the war.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Humphrey Bogart.
Our fighting men have just won history's greatest victory for freedom. Buy bonds for their future and for your own future.
We've got another bond to buy.
It's official. It's all over. It's total victory.
The large military and social spending practices of the 1960s and 70s were two key factors that led to a major economic downturn by the end of the 1970s. The 1980s saw the rise of supply-side economics.
It's morning again in America.
Reaganomics.
You're the trickle-down theory guy.
I'm betting my reputation on it.
The controversial Laffer curve proposed that lower marginal tax rates would eventually generate higher tax revenues. The theory did have its critics.
Let me just give you a difference that I have with Governor Reagan on taxes. It is what I call a voodoo economic policy.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present.
Read my lips.
The debate over supply-side economics continues to this day. But what is not debatable is that the federal debt exploded in the 1980s. A fundamental shift had occurred. America was becoming addicted to debt. Never before in our history had so much debt been created during an era of relative peace and prosperity. Yes, the Cold War ended, but it came at an extremely high price, and people from across the political spectrum were becoming very alarmed.
You know, I lost a lot of weight when I was in college, deliberately, and back in those days, this was the drink, you know? Yeah. Back in 1992, Warren Rudman, a Republican senator, and Paul Tsongas, a Democratic presidential candidate, along with former Commerce Secretary Pete Peterson, founded the Concord Coalition because they were very concerned about the budget deficit at the time and also the long-term outlook.
And we believe that the Concord Coalition will be a powerful grassroots organization that will say to the politicians all across this country that the American people are ready for truth.
We are now borrowing 22 cents of every dollar that we're spending. And in effect, what we're doing is we're slipping this huge hidden check for our free lunch to our children and our grandchildren. And you ain't seen nothing yet.
This is the issue that the Concord Coalition was formed to address. So, yes, I do feel a particular responsibility to advance the cause. And, you know, things like this, like today's hearing, are just a great opportunity to do so. They don't come along all the time. Some people say, well, this is all gloom and doom. You know, you're talking about all these terrible numbers and statistics, and it's really, you know, if this were gloom and doom, we wouldn't be doing it. It's a lot like dieting. A budget is a diet. The only way you can really lose weight is to get more exercise or to eat less. There are really only two ways that you can balance a budget. You can cut spending or you can raise taxes. And people don't necessarily like those hard choices, so they look for easy solutions.
I especially want to welcome the really outstanding witnesses we have here today. Robert Bixby, the Executive Director of the Concord Coalition that does such good work on trying to alert the nation as to the risks of our fiscal imbalances. Dr. Joe Minarek.
The Budget Committee, sort of think of it as mom and dad sitting around the kitchen table at the beginning of the year figuring out what we can afford. And everybody comes up to them with their ideas about the new things that the family needs, and they have to sort of look at how much income they're going to have and how much they can afford to spend. Well, the family hasn't been doing too well. We've been running deficits of $200 to $300 billion, which is quite a bit of money. We're involved, all of us here at this table, in the fiscal wake-up tour. Dave Walker is involved in that as well. And we've been going around the country holding town hall meetings and talking to the local media. And we are finding the public seems to be willing to hear the tough choices. What they want to make sure is that you're serious about them. I think everybody realizes that that sort of a family budget is unsustainable over the long term, and the family's going to be in a lot of trouble.
In the last 40 years, we've had 35 budget deficits and only 5 budget surpluses. But remember, we've been running large annual surpluses in our Social Security program for years. These surpluses are spent every year to help pay other bills in the federal government. Without the Social Security surpluses, our real track record on deficits looks a whole lot worse.
This is something that's utterly unsustainable. And remember, all of that has happened before the baby boomers retire. And the baby boomers are not a projection. They're born, they're out there, they're going to be eligible for Social Security and Medicare, and yet we can't pay our bills now.
In less than 10 years, Social Security will be paying out more than it takes in, and it will only get worse as baby boomers retire in larger and larger numbers. By 2017, Social Security will not be helping to reduce our overall deficit, it will be adding to it. Our enormous Medicare deficits and other federal spending that also lie ahead will only make this situation worse.
The only issue that's more severe than this would be the idea that an Islamic fundamentalist would get his hands on or her hands on a nuclear weapon and use it against us. Beyond that, there's nothing that's more severe than this. This issue represents the potential fiscal meltdown of this nation, and it absolutely guarantees, if it's not addressed, that our children will have less of a quality of life than we've had, that they will have a government they can't afford, and that we will be demanding so much of them in the area of taxes that they will not have the money to send their kids to college or buy that home or just live a good quality of life.
Obviously, if the public doesn't understand, there's going to be no sense of urgency and no pressure on our colleagues or the White House to act. I thank this panel, and we'll stand in adjournment.
Right now, if you look at the federal budget, it's running a deficit, and it will probably run a deficit for the next several years. Those deficits are not off the charts. We've been there before. But what is really worrisome is the longer-run future. If you look at just 3 programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, the spending for those programs under current rules will rise very rapidly over the next few years, indeed for the foreseeable future. Longevity increases and rising medical care spending are symptoms of being a rich country. However, we've got to do something about it. Unless we're willing to raise taxes and keep on raising them, or close down the rest of the federal government, we've got a very big problem staring us in the face.
Jefferson went on record saying that it was immoral for one generation to load up the next generation with debt. In private life, we don't do that. A person goes to his grave and his debts go with him, more or less. But in public, we do. In public, we have the system whereby one generation can spend money before it's been earned. And it spends the money, and then somebody's got to pay that money in the future, and that somebody is the next generation. To me, that is an immoral situation, and it's not just immoral, it's just fundamentally wrong and mean for one generation to spend the next generation's money.
funny. You see me?
I know, I am scaring people. That's the point, man. That's a scary issue.
You don't want to scare them away from us then. You want to scare
okay.
When we thought of the idea of starting CYA, the goal was to be the face of the generation that's going to be affected by the national debt and to kind of try to put a human touch to it.
All I gotta say is talk to your congressman, talk to your senator, talk to the GD president.
I'm coming to you.
We gotta fix this problem.
It stinks. You know, our parents talk our ears off from the time we're 10 about financial responsibility. This is what you have to do. Don't get into credit card debt. You have to pay for what you buy. You have to save your money. And then the politicians who are supposed to represent your values and represent what you want, they aren't doing the same thing. They're telling you one thing and doing another thing.
Would you like to go on a date with me? No. Would you like to learn about the debt? Yes.
You kind of want to look at them and say, how can you not realize that this is going to damage our future?
I mean, this situation is comparable to my parents incurring serious credit card debt before I was born and through my entire lifetime, and then expecting me to pay for it at some point in the future. And that's insane.
We're not playing. We're not in a play. We are serious.
Whenever you talk to someone about the problem, they're always like, yeah, that's really interesting. That's awesome. That's about it. It's hard to really, really get kids inspired. But I think we're starting to do that. We're starting to get a lot of interest, especially with the 2008 election, and the youth starting to realize that they do have a voice, that kids are now starting to take the extra step. And that's really nice to see. It sort of gives you hope.
You know, there's this perception that, oh, the public doesn't care about these are just numbers, you know, it's boring stuff. When we go out and do our town hall meetings, people love it. What they're frustrated with is that they can't get straight answers from politicians, or they're told things that just don't make sense, like, oh, we can cut taxes and add a prescription drug benefit to Medicare, and, you know, instinctively people think, I don't think that really adds up, you know, but I mean, this guy is telling me that I can have it all, so, okay, all right, I'll vote. I'll vote for him.
Well, you get your motor running, head out on a highway, looking for adventure and whatever comes in our way. Well, tonight I'm gonna make it happen, take the world in a love embrace, fire up all of my guns and explode into space.
The Concord Coalition has never taken a position on big government versus small government. The point is we're running a completely schizophrenic tax and spending policy right now where we've got a big government spending program, a small government tax program, which is a recipe for deficits as far as the eye can see. You know, this isn't the most sophisticated chart you're ever going to see, but it illustrates the problem.
My name is Scott Spradling. I am a political reporter for WMUR-TV, an ABC affiliate here in New Hampshire.
BIXBY?
Yankee frugality is alive and well here in New Hampshire, and when it comes to numbers and crunching the dollar signs, this is the state where this type of a dialogue makes a lot of sense.
No one covers New Hampshire like we do. We're WMUR News 9.
Now at 5 o'clock, a live look at the skyline. Off the top of my head, it's the type of story that we'll probably put into the middle of the newscast. It's a red meat dialogue, something that will try to just bring some attention to what this effort is, what the tour is, and I'm sure it'll get some moderate play in the news.
And in other news tonight, man allegedly steals a diamond ring, then swallows it in front of police.
Our Heather Hamill is live in Hollis tonight with quite a bizarre story. Heather?
This $7,000 diamond engagement ring won't be going on anyone's finger anytime soon. Police say thanks to Kenny Narin.
Our federal financial problem is worse today than it was in 1992. But back then, the media, business leaders, along with Ross Perot and Paul Tsongas, made fiscal responsibility a key issue during the presidential campaign. The country woke up, recognized the challenge, and demanded change.
We come here today, Democrats and Republicans, to celebrate a true milestone for our nation. In a few moments, I will sign into law the first balanced budget in a generation.
politics of sound fiscal policy are very difficult because the natural inertia in the political system, if you will, is toward federal programs, most of which are very useful. And therefore the inertia is towards spending on the one hand and tax cuts on the other hand. But if you're going to have sound fiscal conditions, you have got to both constrain your spending and you also have to provide for adequate revenues. And what ultimately is involved are very difficult trade-off decisions involving federal programs and what the American people want their government to do, and then providing the means to pay for it. I left Treasury in July of 1999. In 1998, the federal government of the United States had a fiscal surplus for the first time in, roughly speaking, 30 years. And the projections forward, based on the fiscal policies then in place, were for continued surpluses for long, long into the future. And I thought that what had happened, well, I don't actually, I'm going to say what I thought. What had happened was that a political coalescence had occurred or had developed around maintaining fiscal discipline, which is a very difficult thing to do politically because it requires spending constraint and adequate revenues. And I thought we were on that track.
It happened this week, something few of us thought we'd ever see. The national debt clock was turned off at noon last Thursday, having outlived its purpose. While the national debt has hardly disappeared, it stands somewhere in the $5 trillion range, it is slowly winding down, having dropped by over $100 billion since the first of the year.
Did you know millions of Americans live with debt they cannot control? That's why I developed this unique new program for managing your debt. It's called Don't Buy Stuff You Cannot Afford.
Oh, let me see that. If you don't have any money, you should not buy anything. Sounds interesting.
Sounds confusing.
I don't know, honey. This makes a lot of sense. There's a whole section here on how to buy expensive things using money you save.
Give me that. And where would you get this saved money?
How much money do you guys have in your savings accounts?
A couple $100.
About 1,000, maybe.
Are you talking about money-wise? I end up using most of the money in my savings account, so it doesn't really like work as a savings account. Like I'm not actually saving anything. I'm just storing it there.
I think most people can say that they live paycheck to paycheck. I think the good majority of us do.
David, we've got you right here. Robert, you're right over here, the introductions. This is Dean Board. How are you?
I'm David Yepsen, and I'm a political columnist with the Des Moines Register. The most important issue in the campaign is Iraq, but I think this issue is really the most important issue facing the country.
Okay, stand by, please. Up on camera 2. Go ahead.
Debt denial. Some see the nation ignoring a red ink tsunami. We'll question United States Comptroller General David Walker and Concord Coalition Public Policy Group Executive Director Robert Bixby on this edition of Iowa Press.
2019.
You talked about the national credit card being run up. What about the individual credit cards?
Too many Americans are following the bad example of their federal government. They're spending more money than they make. They're taking out home equity loans. They're charging up their credit cards. They're building up compound interest and seeing the day in the not-too-distant future where they may not be able to make the minimum
Does that exacerbate the national problem?
It clearly does, because for 2 years in a row, American households have spent more money than they took home. A negative savings rate. The last time that happened was 1933 and 1934. Not good years for America or the world. Now, we're in a very different situation than 1933 and 1934. But the reason we have to borrow from foreign players who hold more of our national mortgage, who have more leverage on us and we have less leverage on them, is because we're not saving, and that's got to change.
I think it's going to take a crisis before America responds to this. This is America. We don't do anything until something reaches a crisis, whether it's military rearmament before World War II or whether it's this question now. We're not going to be willing to take this pain until it gets to be a real problem.
The concepts of sacrificing and building for a better tomorrow have been pushed aside by our live for today, easy credit, and consumption-oriented society. Many Americans have never seen a rainy day, and therefore simply choose not to save for one. This is a major problem because savings result in increased investment, additional research and development, a stronger economy, and an improvement in our overall standard of living.
Is America's low savings rate today strictly a matter of personal choice? Or are there also other forces at play here?
Dr. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Greenspan. I understand that you did not take my friendly advice last fall. I thought maybe you should look for other employment, but I see you kept your job. I'm pleased that you're back, though, because at least you remember the days of sound money.
In the early 70s, due to the breakdown of the monetary system, it excited me enough to want to speak out.
The concern a sound money economist has is for the supply of money. If you increase the supply of money, you have inflation. I know Wall Street likes it, and the economy likes it when the bubble's getting bigger, but I think it's harmful.
Inflation is very simple. When government arbitrarily, out of thin air, prints money, creates money and credit out of thin air. And when I talk to many teenagers, grade schoolers, they seem to have no problem comprehending the fact that if you just create a lot of money, it'll be like monopoly money and it won't have value.
Dr. Paul, you're raising an issue which a significant number of people have been raising over the years, and for which, frankly, we're not quite sure what the answers are.
Alan Greenspan was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. I see the central bank, the Federal Reserve System, as having this tremendous power over money and credit. Greenspan, or any chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, is more powerful than even our president because he has so much control over the economy. Many countries have bitten the dust through the inflation, even in ancient times. This is a very serious problem, and the biggest fear will be that if the Fed creates too much money, we're going to have a crash of the dollar.
And for 3 years, you've never been once in the target range. You know, if I set my targets and I perform like that as a physician, my patient would die.
Is the gentleman finished? Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Paul. Mr. Watts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Because the value of your saved dollar can be impacted by the money supply, any talk of savings is incomplete without discussing the Fed. The Federal Reserve is the primary force in determining our nation's money supply. This is known as monetary policy, and it should not be confused with what is called fiscal policy, which relates to tax and spending policies set by the Congress. The Fed's two main policy goals are, first, to help stimulate economic growth, and second, to try to keep inflation low. These goals can conflict. When the Fed determines that the economy needs a stimulus, interest rates are lowered, borrowing becomes easier, and more money flows into the economy. This is known as opening the Fed window, and the result is an increase of the money supply. When inflation is rising, which means that the dollar is quickly losing value, the Fed raises interest rates, borrowing becomes more expensive, and money eventually flows out of the economy. This closing of the Fed window decreases the money supply. Severe inflation requires a very tight monetary policy, which often leads to increased unemployment and greater reliance on personal savings. In a worst-case scenario, the economy can become stagnant and inflation can increase, a situation called stagflation. The Fed is then faced with an extremely difficult choice because it can't raise interest rates and lower them at the same time. It must choose either to stimulate the economy or to fight inflation. This last happened in the 1970s, and it was a very difficult time for our country.
I was in the Nixon White House, first as an economic advisor to President Nixon, and then as Secretary of Commerce. Well, I think history will record that Federal Reserve was part of the problem. They let money supply get out of control. When Paul Volcker took over, he realized the need for tough action. But it's hard for many people to believe that interest rates were, as I recall, at the extraordinary level of 15 to 20% annually. And he had to take truly courageous action, and he did.
That's a book for you, full of Richard's Almanac.
With an introduction by Paul A. Volcker. I recommend it to you at your nearest bookstore. I think one of the lessons of that period, and these lessons have to be learned and relearned, is don't let the inflation get started, because once it gets some momentum, it kind of feeling that it's inevitable, we'll find ourselves back in the days of stagflation and unacceptable economic performance, and very difficult to deal with. There's a little flavor of that at the moment.
This is an NBC News special report. All kinds of economic indicators turning south. New foreclosure stats out today and the like. Tim, these are tough times for the president to face the press.
He is hearing it from everybody in his own party, the opposition party, and from the American people. Prices are skyrocketing, and they're asking, what's the government going to do about it?
With respect to the fiscal crisis looming out there in the future, we'll see whether a democracy can deal with an obvious problem that's going to be present in not too many years, and the earlier we take action to deal with it, the better. The Paul Revere of America these days is David Walker, the Comptroller General, who is absolutely dedicated to the idea of bringing to the attention of the Congress and the American people the fiscal crisis is looming out there.
We've been to 21 states so far and the District of Columbia, and we expect to continue this through the 2008 election.
Before I came here, I was a high school business education teacher. I taught for 38 years. I'm very concerned about the federal debt. I think probably I'll survive, but I worry about my son and my grandchildren and the burden that it's going to place on them.
You know, I don't think that deficit reduction is going to be described as a sexy topic. It is hard to break through with an unsexy message that sort of comes across as kind of like taking a cold shower. It's kind of the, we come along after the sexy messages. Cool people off, I guess.
This is about the future of our country, our children, and our grandchildren. And ultimately, I'd like to think that politicians will rise above partisan politics to do what's right for our country.
Well, my parents were poor dirt farmers, and they obviously wanted better for their kids. Things should get better for each generation. My only child is a college graduate, and I hope my grandchildren are going to be college graduates, but I think it's harder and harder to attain that. For we who are the middle class and the lower income people, we need help. We need help.
Our nation is entering a demographic transformation to an older society, and we're doing so with rising healthcare costs and falling national savings. And that's a very bad combination for the future health of the economy.
Priorities are totally screwed up in this country. I'm not going to be around to see the disaster if it doesn't get better, but my kid and my grandkids are. And it scares me a lot.
In any event, the more money you have relative to the amount of goods, the more inflation you have, and that's not good. So
we're not a free market then? There is an invisible, there is a benevolent hand that touches us.
Absolutely. You're quite correct. To the extent that there is a central bank governing the amount of money in the system, that is not a free market, and most people call it regulation.
And so when you lower the interest rate and drive money to the stocks, that lowers the return people get on savings
Yes.
in a bank.
Indeed, yes, indeed.
So they've made a choice. We would like to favor those who invest in the stock market and not those who invest in a bank. That helps us.
No, that's the way it comes out, but that's not the way they think about it.
This bigger. This is about Bernanke. This is about Bernanke. He has to be on that call. Forget the investors. The investors are going to do. If Bernanke Bernanke needs to open the discount window. That's how bad things are out there. Bernanke needs to focus on this. Alan Greenspan told everyone to take a teaser rate and then raise the rate 17 times. And Bernanke is being an academic. It is no time to be an academic. Listen, open the darn Fed window. He has no idea how bad it is out there. He has no idea. He has no idea.
Kramer.
I have talked to the heads of almost every single one of these firms in the last 72 hours, and he has no idea what it's like out there. None! My people have been in this game for 25 years, and they are losing their jobs, and these firms are going to go out of business, and he's nuts! They're nuts! They know nothing!
Kramer.
This is a different kind of market, and the Fed is asleep!
There are three types of people in our country: those who save and invest, those who could easily save more but choose not to, and those for whom savings is very difficult. If Federal Reserve policy creates strong economic growth and keeps inflation low, everyone can benefit. However, if inflation rises, people who are less well off will suffer more.
The Federal Reserve seeks solely to get as high a level of real material well-being as we can by setting a platform of stability. We cannot pick and choose amongst various areas of the population because we just have no means of doing that. If fiscal policy is lax or savings are exceptionally low, there is nothing monetary policy or any central bank can do about that. We cannot live in the present only. Human beings cannot survive unless they create provision for the future.
Americans must start to save again, and they need to invest those savings to help create a better future for themselves, their families, and our country. At the same time, Americans need to know that the money that they are saving will hold its value. Too much easy credit for too long can create a false sense of wealth. No one plays a more important role in all of this than the Federal Reserve.
I think I got it. I buy something I want and then hope that I can pay for it, right?
No. You make sure you have money, then you buy it.
Oh, then you buy it. But shouldn't you buy it before you have the money?
No.
Why not?
It's in the book. It's only 1 page long. The advice is priceless and the book is free.
Wow, I like the sound of that.
Yeah, we can put it on our credit card.
So get out of debt now. Write for your free copy of Don't Buy Stuff You Cannot Afford. And if you order now, you'll also receive Seriously. If you don't have the money, don't buy it.
When I say trade deficit, do you know what that means?
Deficit usually means something like disorder or something, so something is wrong with it. It's not good.
It's the money that the United States owes. Wait a minute.
I have no clue. Sorry.
I have no idea.
I think it's something along the lines of you've borrowed more than you've spent.
Is the trade deficit with other countries, maybe?
So if we have a trade deficit, we're importing more than we're exporting.
Okay, there it is.
In 2007, China had the largest trade surplus in the world. And who was dead last? The United States of America.
I've always liked business, I've always liked investments, I've always liked economics, but I'm a disaster. You know, if you ask me, what happens to a split atom or what happens to a cell within a body. So different people are wired different ways. A few years ago, I wrote an article for Fortune on sort of the parable of Squandersville and Thriftsville, which was designed to simplify for people problems inherent in persistent and large trade imbalances. Economics tends to put people to sleep, and I thought maybe by creating a couple of islands with inhabitants of quite widely different activities that it might get across a point that otherwise they get lost on. The thrust is that if you own a lot of property, an island in this case, you can trade it off for the things that you eat and consume every day, and you can do that for a long time, but eventually you run out of property and then you have to work a whole lot harder to provide your own needs, but also to pay back for the debt you've incurred. short-term actions have long-term consequences that sometimes people don't think about in the short run. In the last few decades, but accentuating in the last 6 or 8 years, this country has started consuming considerably more than it produces. Because we're so rich, we can do it for a long time, and we can do it on a large scale, but we can't do it forever. Eventually you run out. I mean, it's like a credit card. My credit's pretty good at the moment, and if I want to go out and quit working and have no income coming in but keep spending, I can, first of all, sell off the assets I have, and then after that I can start borrowing on my credit card, and if I've got a good reputation, I can do that for quite a while. But at some point I max out, and at that point I have to start producing a whole lot more than I consume in order to clean up my debts. In this country, we have seen imports increase from 5% of GDP to, 17% or so of GDP in the last 35 or so years, and yet we have 4.5% unemployment, and we have a very, very prosperous country. So it's a good thing for us. What is not good is the imbalance between imports and exports. The rest of the world is buying more and more of our goods all the time, but at an even greater rate, we're buying more and more of theirs. That's not good. More trade overall is good as long as it's true trade. If it's pseudo-trade, where we're buying but not selling, I do not think that's good over time.
If you're buying more than you're selling, which is what a trade deficit is, eventually your trading partners are going to own a lot of your wealth. When they are not buying your goods and services with this money, they will be looking for ways to invest it. Running large and persistent trade imbalances can be problematic, especially when a country has a low savings rate and its government needs to borrow more money every year to pay its bills.
When the federal government needs to borrow money,
Yeah.
do you know how they do that?
Don't know.
No. I don't. I don't know.
That is a very good question. I'm under the assumption that everyone else borrows money from us, so...
There's gonna be some giant global repo man that's gonna come by in like 2012 and be like, guys, it's been quite a while, you're way late. You got like interest piling up. We're gonna have to take all your blonde people. I'm sorry.
More savings out of income are required to finance the growing American economy. Savings bonds are one of the finest savings devices. They are a safe, sound investment for the buyer and a source of strength for the nation.
The country has asked the people to invest $1 billion in 1 month to help pay for the war.
The world's free people are united in their determination. Get those bonds. You're sure to be the happier for it.
Get on, get on, get on the road to victory. Get off, get off, get off the rusty, dusty, and
In the past, when we ran large budget deficits, our government turned to Americans to borrow that money. After World War II, virtually all the federal debt was owed to Americans. Today, our high budget deficits, our low personal savings rate, and large trade deficits have caused us to become increasingly reliant on foreigners to finance our debt and provide capital for investment. There's nothing inherently wrong with this in the short term, and the truth is America lends money to other countries. However, as our reliance on foreign lenders increases every year, one might ask, what are the longer-term consequences?
we got another bond to buy.
The American people are a great people. The Chinese people are a great people. The gate to friendly contact has finally been opened.
China is probably the biggest global economic story that there is going right now. It affects everything from big business, Wall Street, to down home America.
I have a mission. We want to make a brand name. We want to make a good factory. We want to make some nice products. We want to catch up with somebody in front of us. We know what our future is. And frankly speaking, I never imagined I can own such a land and make such a big building. People around me get a better living standard. That's good for me. The feeling is terrific when every month I give salary to my workers. I feel I'm very proud about that.
对对，这个也是我们相遇的地方。他有一颗善良的心 ，It's hard， 然后对我挺关照的，然后我们俩共患难来到这个地方。其实这个也是中国的传统文化。我们总共是4000块钱，除了生活以外，生活和房租以外，然后还剩余2500。我们在外面，然后经历一些风雨啊，然后感觉这种传统应该坚持下去。作为一个人，他都应该有个目标。我们的目标就是说，以后将来为我们有个舒适安静的环境啊，或者是说有辆车啊。
Chinese people are worried about the same things that Americans are worried about. They're worried about their health care. They're worried about their retirement. They're worried about boosting their own income. What scares a lot of Americans about China's growing prowess and these $1 trillion plus in foreign exchange reserves is a lot of that money is invested in U.S. Treasury bonds, in U.S. government debt that is keeping U.S. interest rates low and house prices high in the U.S. and allowing the U.S. economy to continue to grow quite well. A lot of people worry that somehow China is going to suddenly ask for its money back and walk away from the U.S. economy. You know, one wouldn't exist without the other one, and I think increasingly the relationship between China and the U.S. is growing tighter, at least economically.
We are a scrap processing facility. That means that we buy the material and process it in a form that mills, steel mills, aluminum mills, copper and brass mills, foundries can consume in their furnaces to produce new metal. The material goes to China, it goes to Korea, Thailand, starting to ship into Vietnam, India, some into Japan. It's consumed by what would otherwise be a U.S. mill. Now that material is going to foreign mills. We've killed our industrial base. We've killed or are killing what made us a great nation. We're giving it to China, to India, to all the other nations of the world to produce our goods, and we're a net importer when we should be a net exporter. The only thing we're net exporting is scrap.
There have been reports that China may indeed start to liquidate some of their treasury holdings.
The Chinese are the second largest holder of U.S. treasuries.
$9 trillion in outstanding U.S. treasuries in total. China holds $400 billion of them.
And it's a huge amount of money.
It's so huge, Sue, it's called China's nuclear option, as you know, and that refers to financial, not ballistic weapons.
If you want to know how it works in Washington, basically, China gets what it wants. We're going to be increasingly dependent on China for our own economic health, so we're going to have to figure out a way to get along with them.
In the fall of 1956, the world was on the brink of a major international conflict. America's allies, Britain and France, were engaged in a battle against Egypt over control of the Suez Canal. the Soviet Union was threatening to intervene on the side of Egypt. America wanted to avoid military action at any cost and demanded that the British and French allies withdraw from the region. When their request was denied, the U.S. turned to financial warfare. America, which at that time owned much of England's debt, threatened to sell off or dump a significant part of its holdings in the British pound.
So, as far as going into any kind of military action under present conditions, of course we're not.
This would have effectively destroyed England's currency. The result? All British and French military forces withdrew from the Suez region within weeks. Some historians consider this the exact moment that the British Empire ceased to exist.
It took 42 presidents 224 years to run up $1 trillion of U.S. debt held abroad. This president has more than doubled that amount in just 6 years. Last year, we borrowed 65% of all the money that was borrowed in the world by countries, 10 times as much as the next biggest borrower. That's why this debt is jumping so dramatically, and it just fundamentally threatens our long-term economic security. If we don't deal with this, our children and grandchildren are going to have a much different life than we have enjoyed. We'll be in such deep haunt to the rest of the world, we'll be dependent on the kindness of strangers. We'll be dependent on other countries continuing to loan us vast amounts of money.
If 15 or 20 years from now, 2 or 3% of the GDP is being paid abroad merely to service the debts or the ownership of assets that have been incurred because we're over-consuming, that will be politically unstable.
We finance these deficits and this debt by borrowing money from other countries, Chinese, for example. What implications does this have for our foreign policy if we're in hock to other governments? Does that give an American president flexibility to make foreign policy decisions, or do we have to worry about what our bankers think?
We have to worry about what our bankers think. You know, when the debt clock was turned off, you know, I thought this is going to get ugly because it sends a signal that the problem is solved. And those of us that were looking at the long-term numbers knew that the problem really wasn't solved and frankly weren't very surprised to see the debt clock go back on again a few years later.
Just before we leave Money Matters this evening, in New York City today, the man who owns the national debt clock has decided to start it again. It shows the United States owes more than $66,000 for every American family. That's more than $6 trillion in all. The sign's owner turned it off almost 2 years ago, and now he says we need to be reminded that the surplus is gone and that deficit spending is back.
Well, my father had many ideas of how to bring out the growing danger of the debt. At one point, he sent out a card, a New Year's card, to all the people in Congress and the Senate saying, Happy New Year, you owe the federal government $30,000. When we put this sign up, we moved it from around the corner and we put it up over the entrance to the IRS, which we thought was very appropriate. The Clinton presidency, the clock we had then could not run backwards, so we covered it up with an American flag. This clock will be able to run backwards. Hopefully we'll get to a point where we can do that. We're rapidly approaching $9 trillion. Unless we're able to reverse the growing deficit soon, we're going to have to order up a new sign.
As our mothers told us when we were growing up, when you have a little bit of extra money, be careful to make sure it doesn't burn a hole in your pocket. Well, quite frankly, it burned a hole through the pocket, through the floor, and, you know, a good way through the planet.
Do you think there's a risk of a recession? How do you rate that?
You know, you need to talk to economists.
I think I got a B in Econ 101. I got an A, however, in keeping taxes low and being fiscally responsible with the people's money. States and our allies have prevailed.
Controversy since being sworn in as Treasury Secretary on January 20th, 2001. There is no doubt O'Neill has a very difficult job.
President Bush 43 asked me to come back to the government and be the Secretary of the Treasury, which I did for 23 months before I got fired for having a difference of opinion.
For the record, the White House is saying that Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill and top economic advisor Larry Lindsey tendered their resignations voluntarily.
The Vice President said, the President's decided to make some changes, and you're one of the changes. And what we'd like to do is have you come over and meet with the President and basically say that you've decided to go back to the private sector. You know, for me to say that I've decided to leave the Treasury is a lie, and I'm not into doing lies, and so that was it. I went back to my office, latched up my briefcase, and went down to the parking space that's reserved for the Secretary of the Treasury, got in my car, and drove back to Pittsburgh. Well, you know, it's a first in my life. I'd never been fired before. I'd only been promoted to ever higher levels of responsibility. But, you know, it was okay with me because I would have really been uncomfortable arguing for policies I didn't believe in. I argued during the second half of 2002 we should not have another tax cut. That was not a popular view. And in fact, it led to a conversation with the Vice President where he basically told me that we don't have to worry about deficits. You know, which I got to tell you was really a shock to me. You know, when the Bush 43 administration took over, we had something over maybe $5.6 trillion worth of national debt. Today, I think the number is $8.8 trillion. That's not an innocent change. It is a monumental change in the debt service that we have to do, in addition to and on top of all of the other things that our country needs to do. You know, I think we only need to look at the fate of other countries who've lived beyond their means for a long time. You inevitably get into trouble. When you get extended to the point that you can't service your debt, you're finished.
If you look at what's happened to great republics in the past, they generally have not fallen because of external threats. They've fallen because of internal threats. Let's look at Rome as an example, which is the longest-standing republic in the history of mankind. The Roman Republic fell for many reasons, but three seem to resonate today. Declining moral values and political civility at home, overconfident and overextended militarily around the world, and fiscal irresponsibility by the central government. You know, we need to wake up, recognize reality, and make sure that we start making tough choices sooner rather than later, and that we're the first republic to stand the test of time.
The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal disaster assistance programs.
New allegations of massive waste of taxpayer money.
God, the books are cooked routinely year after year after year.
Disaster assistance money was used to purchase items such as a $450 tattoo.
Some of the U.S. and Iraqi money that was supposed to help rebuild Iraq was instead buying a lavish lifestyle for some of the people in charge.
$20,000 for resort accommodations in Hawaii.
Estimate $1 billion of fraudulent and improper payments.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$1,300 handgun.
All costs were passed on directly to taxpayers.
$400 massages.
What is it you're doing here? You don't have any money. The American people don't have any money in this government. All they have is debt.
$5,000 for a divorce attorney.
This year, there will be a deficit in terms of our overall budget and spending this year.
$200 bottle of Dom Perignon, purchased at a Hooters restaurant.
And Girls Gone Wild videos.
What is this, Comedy Central?
Some people think that we can solve our financial problems by stopping fraud, waste, and abuse, or by canceling the Bush tax cuts, or by ending the war in Iraq. The truth is, we could do all three of these things, and we would not come close to solving our nation's fiscal challenges. Here's how bad our situation really is. We already have approximately $11 trillion in total liabilities, including public debt. To this amount, you need to add the current unfunded obligations for Social Security benefits of about $7 trillion. Then add Medicare's unfunded promises, $34 trillion, of which about $26 trillion relates to Medicare Parts A and B, and about $8 trillion relates to Medicare Part D, the new prescription drug benefit, which some claimed would save money in overall Medicare costs. Add another $1 trillion in miscellaneous items, and you get $53 trillion. Our country would need $53 trillion invested today, which is about $175,000 per person, to deliver on the government's obligations and promises. How much of this $53 trillion do we have? Zip. By the time today's college graduates are ready to retire, 40 years from now, the only things our government will be able to pay for are interest on the federal debt and some Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid benefits. All other parts of the federal government will be closed and out of business. What about taxes? We would have to raise federal tax burdens across the board, more than 2 times today's levels, to close the financing gap. Some politicians complain when any tax increases are mentioned. We're facing a more than doubling of federal taxes if we continue down our present path. Remember our debt to GDP? By the year 2040, our debt to GDP will be twice the record level at the end of World War II, and it skyrockets after that. Who's going to lend us money then? No matter what you personally believe should be done to address our nation's deficits, the magnitude of our problem is much bigger than people understand. Let's assume for a moment that all earmarks and special interest pork barrel spending were eliminated. They only represent about 1% of our annual federal spending. What if all 3 Bush tax cuts expired in 2010? That would only address about 10% of our federal financial hole. And what about Iraq? Even if the war ended in 2009, the total estimated cost of the war over time is less than 3% of our total financial problem. Our budget, savings, trade, and leadership deficits individually are bad enough, but in combination, they create a toxic mix that threatens our country's and our families' futures. As the baby boomers retire in large numbers, this tidal wave of spending will reach our shores, and we are simply not prepared for it. And trust me, it could swamp our ship of state. Unlike many other problems facing our country, this one is ours alone. We can and we must solve this one. The question is, when will we? As our nation's founder said, it's really up to us, we the people.
here's the thing about the future. If you knew that, say, a levee was unsound, and you knew people were moving into the area, and you knew that they were at risk, would you stand by and do nothing and say nothing about it? Of course not. I mean, that would be irresponsible. Yet that's what we're doing as a nation to the future. We know that we have this problem. We know that the fiscal federal levies are unsound, you might say. We know that the structure is not sound for the long term, and yet we're ushering future generations in and saying nothing about it, doing nothing about it. And that's the immoral part of it.
We've been through a lot together. We've met challenges and faced dangers, and we know that more lie ahead. Yet we can go forward with confidence, because the state of our union is strong.
I mean, you can look at things 20 or 30 years from now and say, this can't happen. Something will change because the debt is just too big.
There's only one person who has the bully pulpit who can take this issue to the people, and that is the President of the United States.
People may think somehow decisions are made by other people far away, but in a democracy, that's not really true. It is your representative in Congress or in the Senate that is influencing what happens. So it's pretty important for people to pay attention to it.
It's actually not that complicated. You know, there's this old saying, there's no free lunch. I think that almost captures the whole thing. Just as for an individual in the final analysis, there is no free lunch. There's no free lunch for a national economy.
We can't afford to pay all these bills, and if we just pay for these bills by printing money, then we'll destroy the currency, and that will be a much, much more painful reaction than us just tightening our belts and living within our means.
I do think that piling up more and more and more external debt and having the rest of the world own more and more of the United States may create real political instability down the line and increase the possibility that demagogues come along and do some very foolish things.
What these various different deficits are suggesting is that we are trying to consume more than we produce. We can do that in the short run, but over the long run, it is of course impossible. Without savings, there is no future.
I think there was a tremendous opportunity for whoever is the next president to really make a very big and important difference for this country by providing serious leadership on this very difficult set of issues.
We need presidents who are so devoted to doing the right thing with and for the American people that they're prepared to lose for their values and to hang their values out in public for everyone to see them.
I have 3 grandchildren. They didn't create this problem, but it's their problem. And if policymakers don't start making the tough choices soon, they're going to pay the price. They're going to bear the burden for the failure of others to act. And that's not acceptable to me. It's morally wrong, and it's time that we righted that wrong.
You will remain Comptroller General of the United States until mid-March, is that right?
Yes, I love my job as Comptroller General. I love the GAO, and by working together with my colleagues here, we've made a huge difference in the 9.5 years that I've been here. At the same point in time, I believe our country is at a critical crossroads. There are practical limits as to what I can do as Comptroller General. I can't advocate specific policy solutions. I can't be as aggressively involved in grassroots efforts as I think will be necessary in order to achieve meaningful and lasting change.
But I might say, Mr. Walker, your service has been in the best of what one would expect somebody serving our great country, and I suspect you'd find that virtually everybody else would agree.
Thank you so much, Senator Leahy. It's been an honor and a privilege to serve.
Good afternoon, Peterson Foundation. Tell us about the Peterson Foundation.
Well, I'm going to be creating this foundation from scratch to make a difference for the country. The mission of the foundation is to get the message to millions of Americans and to propose sensible and workable solutions to address these challenges and to build public will to do something about them. I'm still going to be involved in the fiscal wake-up tour. You know, generals don't leave the fight, but sometimes they change their position on the battlefield, and that's exactly what I'm doing here.
The fact is whether it's rain or snow or sleet or dark of night, the fiscal wake-up tour rolls on.
David Walker joins us live this morning in studio. Mr. Walker, thanks for being here.
David Walker says the country's biggest problem is our national debt. Finally, some good news about Iraq.
David Walker, welcome to Hard Talk.
We can't afford the promises we've already made, much less to be able to piling on top of them.
Please help me thank this distinguished panel.
Please welcome David Walker.
We've got to re-engineer and constrain spending, and we've got to engage in comprehensive tax reform in ways that will promote economic growth but generate more revenues.
Okay, I didn't understand any of that.
Who is David Walker, and why should we care?
Not the only country that faces this challenge, but that shouldn't be an excuse for us not to address this challenge sooner rather than later. And after all, what good does it do to be the best looking horse in the glue factory?
So, Peter, send your comments to the Government Accountability Office, David M. Walker, Controller General.